So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES assists electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have supported elections in European countries since the fall of Iron Curtain. This is the 27th installment in our series, and we have focused on issues ranging from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of Russia in European elections. If you have missed any of our previous discussions, recordings are available on our YouTube channel, and my colleague is putting a link in the chat right now. I'm Nikoleta Diossy, Senior Program Officer at the IFES Regional Europe Office in Prague, which is hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible by the generous support of American people. Today, we are focusing on the situation in Central Europe, in particular the Visegrad 4 countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. We are interested in the current and future of democracy in the region. In particular, how are popular attitudes to democracy changing in Europe? What with the political developments in Hungary and Poland, signs of concerns in Slovakia, and an unclear situation in the Czech Republic. The war in Ukraine impacts Central Europe in many ways, including through increased propaganda by Kremlin government and large numbers of Ukrainians fleeing the conflict. This online discussion will focus on popular trends towards democracy in Central Europe today and in the future. So with us today to discuss these issues, we have Michal Vašečka, sociologist and director of Bratislava Policy Institute from Slovakia, Ingrida Kešušaukajte, Community Cohesion in Central Europe Project Team Leader from IFES Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust and a Senior Research Fellow from UK, and Cassandra Emmons, Senior Democracy Data Analyst from IFES. After our discussion, we will then open the floor for your questions to our panelists. And should you have questions or comments already, you can type those in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So my first question goes to Cassandra Emmons, Senior Democracy Data Analyst at IFES. Cassandra, can you please give us a brief overview of what we know regarding trends in popular attitudes to democracy in Central Europe in the spring of 2023?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for hosting this and for having me. So first of all, we know from an objective level that democracy in the region has been on the decline, and the Varieties of Democracy annual report just this year, released last month, named Poland, Hungary, and Serbia as 3 of the top 10 autocratizing countries in the world over the past 10 years. This problem has been acutely felt among citizens of the Visegrad 4 countries. In January, February of 2023, there was a standard Eurobarometer survey released that asked respondents in all EU 27 member states whether they trust or distrust their national government. Among these 4 countries, in Hungary, 58% of the respondents tend not to trust their national government. And this was a big spike from this past summer when it was last conducted, up 9%. In the Czech Republic, the number is even higher, 67% do not trust their national government. In Poland, 69%. And in Slovakia, an overwhelming 82% said that they tend to distrust their government. Now, when asked whether they believe all EU member states should respect the core values of the EU, which include fundamental rights, rule of law, and democracy, respondents were overwhelmingly in agreement. So over 85% in Czech Republic, 89% in Hungary and Slovakia, and in Poland, up to 90% of respondents agree that all member states should uphold those values. However, when asked whether their own government was performing at a satisfactory level, the numbers were almost in the reverse. So only slightly over half of the respondents in the Czech Republic and Poland agree that democracy currently works well in their countries. In Hungary, less than half, only 46% of respondents were satisfied. And again, we saw that tank pretty dramatically from June and July. And in Slovakia, fewer than 1 in 3 respondents are satisfied with the way that democracy is working in the country. So in sum, we have really disgruntled electorates in these countries right now where anti-democratic challenges are becoming further entrenched and really setting a dangerous precedent.
Thank you, Cassandra. My next question goes to Ingrida Kerušauskaite, Community Cohesion in Central Europe Project Team Leader. Ingrida, I want to hear your views on trends in how people in Central Europe perceive democracy. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Thanks a lot. I think Cassie very well outlined the general views that things do seem to be getting a bit worse in some countries, but I do remain optimistic as there are opportunities for improvement. So there are many threats to democracy, internal and external, as Cassie outlined, and that includes disinformation, including by Russia-aligned stakeholders, which has the potential to affect these democratic processes. Now, our research focused on Ukrainian refugees in Central Europe and community cohesion with local populations. And one of the things that emerged was that the biggest concerns of the people are actually economic. And that's been proven by numerous surveys that show there's one from October 2022, an EU poll that showed 93% of EU survey respondents were concerned about the rising cost of living, food and energy prices. That rose to 95% in Slovakia. And there are other long-standing challenges in relation to housing and healthcare, in addition to financial concerns that have actually given rise to incendiary and misleading narratives that hook on these concerns. And these also have arisen about Ukrainian refugees. That's what our research is focused on. But despite these disinformation efforts, the arrival of refugees, that huge change in the situation, has brought about increased funding and attention to some of these issues. Pressures are on healthcare and housing, and efforts have been supported by multilateral organizations, and there's room to improve the situation, not just for refugees, but for everyone, thereby hopefully improving the trust in the governments in those host countries. And also there are strong civil society and community organizations that are working to uphold democratic principles and values.
Thank you, Ingrida. And let us continue with Michal Vašečka, who is a sociologist and a director of Bratislava Policy Institute. So Michal, we want to deep dive into a particular country to better understand current trends. And you focus mainly on Slovakia. So what is your overall take on how Slovak people view democracy today?
Before mentioning something about Slovakia, let me also react on what has been said. Because obviously, and Cassandra started with a very good point, that democracy and liberal democracy, I mean, the whole Central Europe is backsliding from previous positions. All data coming from, let's say, Freedom House are suggesting it since basically 2016 that there is a regress. I would put it even in a more dramatic way. Central Europe lost its consensus about the liberal future of the whole region. You know, and by liberal, I don't mean liberal ideology, but, you know, certain type of openness, simply not necessarily democracy in its not only illiberal way, but it's in Schumpeter's understanding, which is very limited and I would say problematic. In the whole world, there are doubts about how democracy is functioning at the moment. So before saying anything about Slovakia, we should put it into certain context. In most of countries of the European Union, there are serious doubts on the side of people, and many are suggesting that the system needs a drastic change. People in Spain, in France, in many other countries, there are these usual suspects, basically countries where people seem to be satisfied with current state of arts, New Zealand, Canada, Sweden, but those are rather exceptions in today's world. As for Slovakia, in this context, I have good news and bad news. Good news is that people, when they are asked whether they support the democratic regime, whether they see democracy as the most vital and productive way how to govern the country, how to run the concrete policies, they are basically answering, yes, we want democracy. The truth is that these numbers are slightly but systematically deteriorating from previous positions. You know, I mean, I'm recalling now a very recent study conducted by our institute, where those who basically said that democracy is not the best system how to govern the country, that's already 1/3 of population. In comparison what it was 20 years ago, that's almost dramatic, I would say. You know, in 2004, when Slovakia entered the European Union, these people were absolutely marginal. But at the same time, when they are asked whether they would support authoritarian leader who would rule the country, whether without civil society, without parliament, suddenly it's a majority of population who is answering this way. So as we sociologists sometimes say, many people, some people are suffering by cognitive accidents. You know, they basically have accident and they are able to say two things that they are completely in contradiction, and they are very fine with it. You know, they don't see any problem. But still, the problem of Slovak democracy at the moment is not whether the people support democratic regime or not, but exactly what was already said. The lack of trust in between people and towards institutions is reaching such unprecedented levels that people simply don't trust anything and anybody. In this respect, the fact that they are still supporting democratic regime, or at least they are saying that democracy is the best regime possible, is actually excellent result. Because again, let me repeat, in Slovakia, 75% people basically don't trust each other people, and vast majority of people don't trust any institution. There is practically no politician who would have higher popularity than unpopularity, etc., etc. If you compare some of Western European countries, such as Denmark, how people appreciate and see positively institutions such as police, judiciary system, etc., that's absolutely incomparable with countries such as Slovakia. So again, I would say the problem is that people lost their hope that country might be governed in a positive way in general. So in fact, the authoritarian tendencies, sometimes I read through the certain panic of people who don't know how to change the situation, which they see as hopeless.
Thank you very much, Michal. I will now go back to Ingrida. Ingrida, part of your research relates to community cohesion in Central Europe in relations to the war in Ukraine and the resulting movement of large numbers of people. In your mind, what is the impact of the war in Ukraine on attitudes towards democracy in Central Europe?
Thanks. So I think it has definitely shown the value of democracy to many, and the alternatives to democracy seem more real. But as we've already mentioned, I think a key point is that polarization of societies, and it has increased that polarization from a political perspective. Again, Slovakia is an interesting one to look at. Our research didn't look at Hungary. It worked on the other three countries. But in Slovakia, the peace narrative, which essentially suggests that Ukraine should seek to end the war and the necessary suffering, which might include making compromises to Russia to end the war. So essentially giving up potentially some territory or some concessions just to end the suffering. That is quite a widespread narrative, and including in our research workshops, we did have very different views from some participants on this topic. one participant suggested that it was dangerous to have people have to choose to be either pro or against Russia, as those who are pro-peace, so just essentially concessions on both sides or so, are being considered as pro-Russian. That's very polarizing and divisive. That was a minority view in the workshop, but it was quite an interesting point that even we had people who were working on refugee and migration issues in the workshop, and it was kind of showed that polarization and how people view the matter. From an economic perspective, it can also increase inequalities and polarization, and this provides opportunities for malign actors to exploit the vulnerabilities and more vulnerable populations. So, and this, of course, the inequalities and financial difficulties affect the populations that are already more vulnerable. So the price increases, inflation, housing costs affect the poor more. And although narratives around resentments about the distribution of government resources to refugees versus local populations are still niche, we have seen them in all the countries that we did research on. And there's a bit of a concern that if the economic situation worsens, such narratives saying, why aren't the local populations receiving the support instead of the refugees, could gain traction. And while overall Ukrainian refugees coming to the host countries is predicted to have a positive economic effect, but there's generally low unemployment rate and need for more labor force, and there are skilled people among the refugees that might be able to fill some of those vacancies. Some people, particularly those in the lower skilled jobs, might lose out. And there will be pockets of people that actually do find it more difficult, whereas overall the situation might improve. So again, that kind of increase inequality. And finally, on policy measures that have been designed to support refugees can also have unintended consequences in some countries. So there have been very generous supports in many countries for accommodation for refugees. Slovakia, again, for example, has subsidizes individuals who host Ukrainian refugees or to 1,790 euros per month for properties from 1 to 4 rooms, which is quite significant and is very good for refugees to get accommodation, is good for those who do have the apartments or extra space to rent the accommodation, but it can have an effect on those who are lower incomes, have to rent in a very tight rental market, and they might see price increases. We've seen rental increases in most countries, Poland as well, in the Czech Republic and Poland, it's lack of social affordable houses. And another point of refugees is that they have added to demand in the housing market. In the Czech Republic and Poland, they represent more than 4% of the local population. So it's quite a significant number. And they've also been more likely to settle in cities where housing challenges are already more severe than the more rural places. But despite that, there are opportunities to actually, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that there are opportunities to improve the situation, review where and how things can be improved, and not just for the refugees, but also for the host communities.
Thank you very much, Ingrida. And going back to Cassandra. Cassandra, do you agree with Ingrida, what she just mentioned, or do you see any other trends?
Yeah, I mean, Ingrida covered a lot of very interesting points, and I appreciate it. I'd add just 2 things. One, last week, and speaking more from the economic perspective, we saw the unilateral halt on grain imports from Ukraine that then, of course, trickled up to an EU level because this is an EU policy sphere. But it started with reactions in Hungary and Poland to this, and then were later joined by Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Romania. So, you know, these issues are trickling up to this other level of decision making. And that brings me to the second thing that I would mention, which is just back in December, we unfortunately saw the multilateral aid for Ukraine kind of used as a bargaining chip in some other negotiations where both Hungary and Poland blocked the EU's aid package in order to for Hungary to release some of the funding that had previously been frozen and push through acceptance of its recovery and resilience framework plan. And for Poland too, had an eye towards its own RRP, which included some changes to the judiciary. So we're seeing the war, unfortunately, be used in a number of different highly political situations that could have serious downstream effects on democracy in these countries, even more so.
Thank you, Cassie. And going back to Michal, so in a Slovak context, what has been the impact of the war of the Russian Federation in Ukraine?
Well, a tough question, because it had both positive and negative outcomes. And first of all, we have to know how Slovakia looked like before the war. And let me repeat just a few facts, and I will repeat, I will return later to some of them. Slovakia has been for a long time the most pro-Russian country of the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe, even more than Bulgaria, which is surprising because Bulgaria, naturally it's an Orthodox country. Russia played a very important role in their process of national awakening in 19th century. So, one might expect certain positive affinities coming from Bulgaria, but Slovakia, that never has been in touch with Russia and Russians in 19th century, the first half of 20th century, suddenly proved to be even more pro-Russian. What is even worse, Slovakia was a very pro-Putin country. At a certain moment, 2 years ago, Putin was more popular in Slovakia than in Russia itself, comparing the survey of Levada Center, which is shocking. So in this respect, of course, war had a certain positive impact, that pro-Russian stance slightly dropped down. Putin is popular not among 56% of people, but just among 23, 25, which is still a lot, So, of course, you have to decide whether you understand the cup as full empty or full, or half empty or half full. I see this as a positive trend. However, there has been negative trends, which I have to say that the polarization of the country reached unprecedented moments, where those two parts of society that eventually were able to communicate about certain issues, important issues, and certain important policies in a country, are not able to communicate practically about anything. So in this respect, country that didn't have certain national consensus, as we can see in Poland or Lithuania, found itself in even deeper polarization. But again, we'll see what will happen. All the public opinion polls that are bringing certain problematic results, which are viewed as deeply disturbing from outside of the country, I simply see only as a continuation of previous processes. Let's say Ukrainian refugees are more unpopular than popular in Slovakia, unlike in Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, or Czech Republic. Simply, in all of these countries were hit by refugees from Ukraine. Sometimes it brings a lot of challenges, obviously. And still, outside of Slovakia, people are still positive about Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. They know why that population is helping Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. Slovakia is in other situation where most of people at the moment are speaking negatively about Ukrainians. When there are questions about popularity of certain nations in Slovakia, of course, obviously the most popular are Czechs, then Poles, Hungarians, and Ukrainians, surprisingly, are very, very unpopular. But that's not caused by war. That was the state of art even before the war, and it's coming from 90s. And it requires a lot of analysis why it's that. But again, Ukrainian war in Ukraine just deepened certain tendencies that were very much present in Slovakia, but they were not so much well known outside of the country. So in a way, and now I know I'm cynical, I'm glad that finally it's visible. And sometimes people in Lithuania or Poland are becoming nervous what is really happening in Slovakia. I see it as a precondition of certain positive solutions.
Thank you, Michal. As a fellow Slovak, I am also nervous when I hear this. So going back to Cassandra, Cassandra, naturally, Central Europe is not a coherent unit. There are significant variations between countries. So which countries would you say stand out as the most concerning?
Yeah, so I mean, for those of us who've been following this for a long time, it's hard to not point to Hungary and Poland as some of the long-standing autocratizers in the region, like when I said at the beginning. In both countries, the current governments and the current ruling parties have brazenly taken an axe to what were once respected independent institutions that provided checks on executive and legislative power. So in both cases, we saw the first targets of this being the judiciary and judicial independence being undermined. This institution serves as a check on executive authority. While that was being targeted, also in both countries, we saw the media being bought up and captured, or in other ways, small independent papers being shut out, papers, radio stations, TV stations, all of it. This has been the space for healthy debate, even in the face of these kinds of challenges in the past. So what you get when you remove the area for that healthy debate is a lack of balanced information. And in fact, what we saw from the OSCE's recent reports on the last two elections in both of those countries is that they were deemed unfair because of their media environment. In addition to these two, we also have seen systematic attacks on academic institutions, which again are areas for potentially, different perspectives, different points of view to come out. We've seen attacks on NGOs, non-Christian religious institutions, and then looking at certain segments of society, even with the targeting of the LGBTQI communities in both of these countries, as well as women. So, and both of those, I should say, despite really large public protests. So in sum, what we've witnessed over a very long time in these two countries is a multi-pronged attack to consolidate power for the current ruling parties in what were once regional leaders on the democratic path in the post-1989 moment. So it's really, these are the two that I'm always quite concerned about.
Thank you, Cassandra. And back to Michal. Michal, how would you say that Slovakia compares to other countries in Central Europe when it comes to attitudes towards democracy?
Well, it seems that Slovakia will be dominating the whole debate, but let me be brief. First of all, according to all surveys that are comparative in the last 4 to 5 years, Slovakia becomes the most pro-Russian, the most pro-Putin, the most anti-American, the second, the most Eurosceptic country in the whole Central and Eastern European region, the country where the levels of mistrust are extremely high, very similar to Bulgaria, but even higher than in Hungary, Romania, Poland, or the Czech Republic. The country which has doubts about its Westernness, which is pretty bizarre because, of course, Slovakia is not an Orthodox country, so quite naturally it was a part of the Western world for centuries. But in spite of that, there are certain doubts, and I can continue. So in other words, Slovakia became the country where part of population simply started to live in some parallel space where, you know, there are other rules of the game. So let me give you an example, because this sounds probably too harsh for some. Slovak media are free and I believe very productive. They are representing all segments of society, and you know, I would be very positive about their development. Officially, Slovakia is on 17th place in the world, which is better positioned than many countries in the so-called Western Europe or United States, if you want. In spite of that, 45% of Slovaks believe that Slovak media are deeply problematic, they are not free, and Slovak media are endangered. Why? Because more than half of population simply don't follow them. They are following nonsenses produced on Facebook by simply their neighbors or friends, and this is their source of information. And they started to live simply in a parallel world where there are other rules of the game. Or second one, if something can be said very positive about Slovakia is that in the last 30 years, country had free and fair elections. You can have doubts only about one election in 1998, which were perfectly free, in spite of the fact that it was prepared by so-called Mečiar government, very autocratic, and you can have doubts about whether it was fully fair. And I wouldn't be even harsh on Mečiar regime, comparing to what is happening even these days in Poland, let's say, or in some other countries. So free and fair elections. In spite of that, 42%, and this is the data from 2 weeks ago, have doubts whether there will be free and fair elections in Slovakia. Why? Because politicians representing radicals and extremists are basically suggesting it, and more than 40% believe it. So to somehow summarize it and really be, to have some framework. If we are talking about democratic regime in Central European countries, let me just, as a framework, borrow Larry Diamond, the definitions how liberal democracy should look like. First of all, free and fair elections. Slovakia has free and fair elections. This is not a problem, and I believe this is not going to be a problem even in the future. Active civil society. Secondly, Slovakia has a very active civil society. Thirdly, protection of rights of all inhabitants. Well, this is a problem. This is a problem with various groups of people, and I wouldn't be over optimistic. But the biggest problem is the fourth part, and that's a problem in many of our countries, and that's a rule of law. So the biggest problem of our democracies, I believe, at the moment is increasing problems with securing rule of law in a country. Once we will secure this part, only the last one will be somehow not fulfilled completely, protection of rights of all inhabitants. And then, of course, we might see the democracy, or if you want, liberal democracy in Central Europe reawakened.
Thank you very much, Michal. And going back to Ingrida. Ingrida, from your research, what variations do you see in popular attitudes to democracy in Central European countries?
Thanks. So I think a lot has been said about this this topic, but I'd pick up on two kind of thematic matters. So one is the penetration of Russian and other disinformation. I think both Cassie and Michal already mentioned a bit, Michal giving a lot of information about the situation in Slovakia and the kind of pro-Russian, the higher pro-Russian attitudes than other EU countries. The one point that I'd add to that is also the higher than average belief in conspiracy theories, which helps pro-Russian and related disinformation and false narratives to spread. But Slovakia isn't the only one. There's generally, I think, a need to increase people's skills to recognize false information more broadly. As an example, in the Czech Republic, an IFES survey from July 2022 found that fewer than 48% of Czechs could easily recognize disinformation. So it's a matter that is probably more broad than just Slovakia. The second point would be, again, the financial challenges, which can very much influence people's attitudes to democracy, and narratives can be hijacked by various malign actors. And I think that links with what Cassie mentioned about the judicial and media independence concerns in Hungary and Poland, and the related challenges that countries have brought to the EU about linking their funding and the budget mechanism to those countries, to the adherence to democracy and certain rule of law points that Cassie mentioned. So that kind of those financial matters, which could help alleviate some financial pressures, are actually very much linked to the democratic principles when it comes to the EU.
Thank you, Ingrid. And now we move to the last part of our discussion. So I turn to Michal. So let's end this by talking about solutions. What can and should be done to strengthen democratic resilience in Slovakia?
I'll try to be brief. As I suggested, Slovakia found itself in something what I call conspiracy hell. Once you have 1/2 of population that is basically understanding terms differently than mainstream population, which in this case is actually doubtful whether we are talking still about mainstream, because those two parts are actually equally big, then you have a problem. It's like in Orwell's 1984. Suddenly black is white, good is evil, war is a peace, and suddenly you have difficulties to find common ground. So speaking about democratic resilience, as far as Slovakia is concerned, we have to find at least elementary ground where we will understand terms equally. So even a very term democratic regime will be understood the same on both sides, so to say. And this is a primary issue in Slovakia, unfortunately. What I see as another issue when we talk about democratic resilience, it's also about the narratives about Slovak past, narratives about real socialism in Slovakia, or even fascist Slovak regime, are still somehow problematic and not critical enough, I would say. And I'm talking about both regimes that harmed Slovakia dramatically, and there are still a lot of people who would be advocate of both. And in fact, in Slovakia, these two regimes that for some people might be unreconcilable, there are people who are able to unite them, and they might be speaking nicely about both, because in fact what they are appreciating is undemocratic character of both of them, and these narratives are still among us, and this is something what brings a lot of distrust of pro-Western democratic people in Slovakia about the future. And the last one, to be harsh enough, countries like Slovakia that are visible targets of some other countries, in this respect of Russia, which is spreading disinformation in our space. A country such as Slovakia, there are countries that are trying to protect itself. Poland or Lithuania or Latvia are very good examples of it. Slovakia never really reacted practically on anything, in spite of the fact that we knew that GRU was present on the territory of Slovakia, working with some groups of Slovak extremists, that the disinformation are coming directly from Russian embassy in Slovakia, using American Facebook, which, by the way, is cancelled in Russia itself. You know, it's not operating there, etc., etc. Simply, Slovakia took for granted its democratic character and never really protected itself. And in this respect, war in Ukraine brought a new, at least a little bit of new approaches. So, you know, I am relatively optimistic that everything what we went through in last years will be changed, and hopefully Slovakia will start to protect its democracy.
Thank you so much, Michal. And back to Ingrida. Broadening the issue to all of Central Europe, what would you identify as the key steps that need to be taken to protect democracy?
Thanks. So I think I singled out three types of approaches. So first would be a more thorough analysis of who stands to win or lose from various changes in policies, and designing specific interventions to support those that might be losing out. So that would be essentially incorporating community cohesion considerations into broader efforts to improve operational concerns in relation to housing or healthcare. That's often done in donor-funded programs, but I'm talking here about expanding this more broadly within government and other non-donor funded programs and initiatives. The second would be stronger strategic communications and counter-narrative campaigns by governments, and designing those to penetrate information bubbles. Now, that might be easier said than done, but some governments are much more active at strategic communications and counter-narratives than others. And I think really investing more in understanding what might change perceptions of people who might be more in bubbles, who might be getting their information from certain, neighbors and friends, as Michal said, and Facebook, how to reach those people and try to actually have that engagement and have the more accurate and reliable information reach them too. And some of the messages there might include stressing that the situation is manageable, emphasizing shared values, and also as much care should be taken in selecting the messenger, so who is delivering the message, as the message itself. And the final point would be to organize more joint activities and events that would allow people from different communities to get to know one another. So that includes refugee communities and communities, but also different parts of the local communities there, to build trust, mutual understanding, and with it resilience to malign influence and disinformation. So because of many everyday pressures relating to work, family, and broader challenges, different communities might not generally engage socially. Within our workshops that we did, as I mentioned, there were key experts working on refugee issues, working with refugees. In most countries, people after the workshops came away saying, I hadn't really realized that we didn't engage much socially between the different communities. And those were people who were working with with the two different communities. So I think it's just activities that allow people to get to know one another when doing activities that all enjoy, not specific designed, come here to meet the other communities, could also be valuable in this regard.
Thank you so much, Ingrida. And my last question is to Cassandra. Cassie, what is IFES doing to support democratic resilience in Europe?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. So IFES is very proud to be actively supporting democracy defenders in the region. I'll be very brief. We have longstanding civic education programming in Ukraine as well as other countries across the region. And in Ukraine, I should say, like, our programming has been able to continue in new and innovative ways through the invasion, through the war. There are Regional Europe Office, of course, the sponsor of this event, has been active in the region for a very long time on a number of different issues. At a regional level, in partnership with the Sealy Institute, we've sponsored and supported anti-corruption programming, working also on the ground with local partners in BiH, Bulgaria, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Romania. And the final thing that I'll mention is actually part of IFES global programming. Our newly launched Democratic Resilience Lab is a forum through which we're responding to these global trends of democratic recession and autocratic resurgence that, like we've been discussing today in this region, but as Mikhail rightly pointed out at the beginning, this is really a trend that we're seeing globally. And so using this forum, one of our goals is to try to draw lessons and parallels between what has worked in one place that could potentially be used in another place to defend democracy there too. So building those kinds of networks that Ingrida was just talking about and learning across regions, within regions, across boundaries of all kinds.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And to all our panelists, we now move to a Q&A. So if anyone from the participants have a question, you can use the Q&A function and type any question or comments. So I will start reading because there already has been a couple that came in. So there is one to Michal from Stefan Swed. So when Slovaks or others are asked about support for democracy, or what kind of democracy, how do they understand democracy, how much liberal in the democracy that is Central European support? Can you please unpack this a little bit?
Very good question, and it's very doubtful how people understand it, and it was very visible from most of public opinion polls conducted in this respect. Democracy is not necessarily in the eyes of some connected with the rule of law. That's bizarre, and democracy is usually connected with certain possibilities, but not necessarily with rules of the game. Yeah, so very often democracy is blamed as a system that brings anarchy, chaos, problematic decision making as far as public policies are concerned. So very often people have certain chaos in that, and we can see it in how perception of democracy was changing since our entry into the European Union 19 years ago. That time, people believed that if we had certain problematic issues with our so-called Carpathian style of democracy, it's because it's a Carpathian democracy. But once we will be in the European Union, everything will be solved. There was a dramatic hope, and I would say very unrealistic, that everything will be changed, will be not only rich, but also the democracy will improve itself just by some miracle. And it didn't happen. And certain distrust of our democracy as a system started to rise. You know, again, 20 years ago, it was just a very marginal thing. Now it's increasing. It's only 70% of Slovaks who are saying democracy is a good system in general. So in theory. So in this respect, it's very questionable how people understand it. And qualitative analyses are bringing better results than quantitative, because in quantitative we don't have a chance to explain it to those people. And in qualitative analysis we see that in fact support for democratic solutions and participatory democracy is actually even lower than in quantitative, where those people are answering in general.
Thank you, Michal. So there is another question to all of our panelists. What are the reasons for the decline in support for democracy? Is it geopolitics, disappointment with the fruits of the transition? How much of this decline is about unhappiness with the EU or their respective countries' role in? Side question, is support for technocracy growing? So who would like to start?
I can throw out a couple ideas and then my co-panelists can throw in some more. This is a very loaded question and complicated one. You know, if you look at when the trends start to take place, it's impossible to disentangle that from the global financial crisis. And if we think about who the biggest losers in that kind of an economic crisis were, and in the subsequent efforts to respond to that crisis and come out of it, there's definitely part of this is economic winners and losers on a global scale that's impossible to ignore. That also shone the light on some, you ask about how much it is to do with the EU and unhappiness with it. I think that crisis highlighted a lot of the failure of incomplete and insufficient institution and policy making, which then there were attempts to close those gaps. And this is a very common story in the building of the EU. You know, there's the whole failing forward narrative, but this doesn't do a lot to make people feel confident that they're getting out of this form of government what they thought they would. And then, of course, you have external pressures of all different kinds. We've been talking today about Ukrainian refugees, but there was a refugee crisis also labeled as such in Europe in 2015, right? And so that had a lot of downstream, you know, so many different narratives, unfortunate narratives around that, but all of this has led to different ways to criticize democracy, which when democracies are functioning, they're allowing for debate and for multiple different viewpoints, and they're honest about their failures in these situations. And so if you're going to be transparent about not having responded in the best way, it becomes very easy for the authoritarian side to come and just point out the failures without necessarily needing to have the solution that they're offering. And people can identify with that. Yes, like we also see that as a failure, and it doesn't get to the next question of, so what do we do, unfortunately. So I think there's a lot of these pieces. I'd love to know if Mikhail wants to talk also more about the memory here, because I would defer to him on that. But those are just a few things that I would throw into the conversation.
If I may jump into it, speaking about dissatisfaction with democracy in our countries, I will bring just one dimension, of course, and it's not satisfactory. Democracy can simply function only in countries that have a deep understanding of the democracy. Czechoslovakia, more than 100 years ago, started with Thomas Masaryk as its president, who was basically saying, well, finally we have democracy, so now let's search for some Democrats who will fulfill simply what has to be part of the democracy. Simply democracy, and we all know it, those of us who studied these things, democracy is a process, and it's never achieved, you know, it's never fulfilled. It's like in mathematics, you remember with the limit. Limit is something what you are trying to achieve, but you will be never there. And every new generation has to work on it. And we in Central Europe, we are very deterministic. So I believe that for the first time, since we have a democracy, all of us, for a relatively long time, which is almost a miracle in Central Europe, by the way, now we are learning our lesson that, you know, this is, once you achieve democracy, you have to work on it again and again. So this is a source of my optimism that now we are learning that lesson, you know, lesson that was learned in other countries years ago. Look at the United States. Democracy is visibly endangered in that country, but still there are many people who simply understand it as a moment in a US history that might be overcome precisely because they know that there are enemies of open society, enemies of democratic procedures that are coming again and again, and they're trying. And the Democrats should simply respond to that. We are learning our lesson at the moment. So, and this is source of my optimism that at least some of us might come victoriously from that battle.
Can I just add a couple of things? Yeah, the first one, just echoing what Cassie said on the financial challenges, and just maybe zooming in into the last year, that actually inflation has been very, very high in the last year. In the last decade, housing prices have risen much faster and rents have risen much faster than wages have. So actually the economic situation has been declining, and quite a few people are finding themselves in challenging financial situations, and that kind of inequalities point can just make it quite easy for them to be disenfranchised. And for some of them, that bring it back to Ukrainian refugees, there are a lot of narratives in each country we looked at about the refugees are coming in fancy cars and Lexuses, and our poor or struggling taxpayers' money is going to give them free food and accommodation and anything else, and they're just free riding. So those kind of narratives can very easily be kind of resonate with people who have been genuinely struggling. And with the information bubble, so people do get more of their news about what the real situation is from Facebook, from closed, smaller groups, it becomes quite easy to believe that the government is not working for you, but they're being captured by, you know, we had the kind of Soros capture points come up in a few kind of workshops as well, that the government is actually working in foreign interests to help others. They've now been directed to help Ukrainian refugees, not you. You're being forgotten here, that democracy means that someone else is actually calling the shots. So, I mean, it's quite easy, I think, in this kind of a situation with the financial challenges and the kind of echo chambers of news that can be created with social media and so on, to influence people's trust in democracy.
Thank you very much, Ingrida. One more question to Michal. From our audience. Does previous support for Putin correlate with support for a strongman, in quotes, at home? Is Poland an outlier, or is it Slovakia?
Yes, the correlation suggested in a question is obvious and very high. And I would even add many other correlations. Those who were opposing any anti-COVID measures, they are the ones who are convinced that Russia is not aggressor in Ukraine. So in this respect, you can still see the same group of people. By the way, when I was mentioning those 42% of people who believe that media freedom is endangered in Slovakia, and those 45% who believe that elections might be not free and fair, it's basically, again, 45. So still the same people who are, and that's why I'm saying, and maybe some people might feel it as a harsh evaluation, those people started to live in other space. And I'm not stigmatizing them. Simply, we differently understand even basic terms, white, black, good, bad, so even very basic terms are understood so dramatically differently that I'm thinking how you want to secure social cohesion or elementary social cohesion in such a situation. So that question basically brought also the answer. Yeah, it's very much so.
Thank you so much, Michal. So we have come to an end of our time together. I again want to thank all the panelists and all of you for your participation. I wish to thank again to USAID for supporting this event and my IFES colleagues. The next installment in the discussion series will be held either late May or beginning of June. I hope to see you all in the discussion, and until then, I hope that you stay safe. Thank you.